I'm Thomas Pogge, the director of the Yale Global Justice Program, one of the sponsoring organizations of this event, alongside the Yale Poynter Fellowship in Journalism, which has been supporting the visit to Yale this semester of our moderator, Khadija Sharif, as a Poynter Fellow. Based in South Africa, Khadija Sharif is an award-winning investigative journalist and senior editor for Africa at Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Sharif is the former director of the Platform for the Protection of Whistleblowers and currently also a board member of Finance Uncovered. She has worked with forums including the Pan-African Parliament, the African Union, the OECD, and the UN Environmental Programme. Her work is focused on illicit financial flows, natural resources, and political economy. She is the author of Taxes If You Can, Africa. Khadija will introduce today's topic, the business of private prisons, as well as our treasured guests, Ruth Hopkins, Edwin Naidu, and Lauren-Brooke Eisen.
We're very fortunate to have with us today three people who are legal and investigative specialists and who have dedicated their lives to the business of the world's most vulnerable bodies, people that the rest of the world generally just discards, and the conditions that create, profile, and punish them. Ruth Hopkins, our main speaker, is an award-winning investigative journalist who was based in South Africa until 2018. She worked as an investigative editor and researcher with the Wits Justice Project, writing about wrongful convictions, lengthy remand detention, police brutality, and interrelated criminal justice issues. But she has a very long history into the subject. She previously wrote books and long investigative exposés about trafficking women into Europe. One book was called I Will Never Let You Go Again, and it was based on 5 years of research into Bulgaria, Ukraine, and the Netherlands, where sex work is legal. She'll be presenting alongside a leading South African journalist who now works at the Wits Justice Project, Edwin Naidu, and he generally investigates violence in South African prisons, but he's also been pursuing this particular prison called Mangaung that Ruth will tell us more about, the second largest private prison in the world. We also have Lauren-Brooke Eisen, who's the director of the Brennan Center's Justice Program. She leads the organization's work into ending mass incarceration and into the social and economic systems and cycles that lead to those situations. She's the author of Inside Private Prisons: An American Dilemma into the Age of Mass Incarceration, published by Columbia University, and she served on various advisory boards and task forces, including the Prosecutor Project, which tries to develop more efficient and effective prosecutorial practices. So just briefly before we turn it over to Ruth, the question is, why does their work matter so much? If people who are criminals harm society, they should be put away. But as we know, in a global capitalist economy, everything is priced, from resources to public services to crisis and even to bodies. So every fragment of life is considered a potential to make a new frontier market and to make that market as profitable as possible for those who hold power and money. And very often the two sectors are intertwined. More and more, as time goes by, we see the privatization of things that should have been a public good or which should be done by custodians that we elect for the protection of society. But very often this is removed into the private sector that the public sector should have or should intend to regulate and hold accountable. So we see militarism rather in democratic societies, for example, like South Africa, and militarization in those societies that lean towards authoritarianism. So on the one hand, democratic societies say we need to beef up our police and our army to keep the state safe. And on the other hand, you see these dictatorial or authoritarian societies that try to lock everything down using force. And in both societies, we see a policing of the poor as if they are enemy combatants, not human beings, and people who pose a problem just by virtue of being alive. So in the US, and in South Africa, there's a painful and very enduring legacy of apartheid and slavery. So in the US, you have the cycle of poverty, profiling, and prison, the 3 Ps, that approaches the poor from the lens of a mass carceral state. And from an outsider's view, from someone who lives in South Africa, it looks like specific disenfranchisement laws are being created to load people down with criminal and felony charges to prevent them from voting. So that in itself changes the balance of power, of political participation, of representation. By 2010, I think I read in ProPublica that over 20% of African Americans in Florida and Virginia were banned from voting at all. And if these states were considered countries globally, you'd see something like 20 to 23 states taking first place all over the world for the highest incarceration rates per 100,000 people. So Kentucky, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama. And this is higher than authoritarian regimes like Russia or El Salvador, which has massive organized crime that performs as a parallel state power, where the rate is actually lower than Utah and Maryland. So when you have a country like Russia that has a lower incarceration rate than Utah, you're facing a very big problem. And a big part of this are the specters of war that have been opened up. You see the war on crime in the 1960s, the war on drugs in the 1980s, and then the war on terror. So brown and poor people become not only easy targets, but almost immediate targets, identifiable targets, driving while Muslim, walking while Black. And it doesn't seem to be an accident, because almost around the same time that African Americans got the Voting Rights Act in 1965, Lyndon Johnson introduced a law enforcement act that allowed for criminalization to happen very, very easily, especially for non-white citizens in southern states. So to an outsider, it seems like in the United States, as in South Africa, there's economic apartheid as the fault line that creates these conditions. From 1910 until the year 2000 or 1999, African Americans lost 90% of their farmland to corporate landowners and speculators because they didn't have a piece of paper showing a history of land ownership. And much of this occurred in southern states that pursue prison gerrymandering, using that land to build prisons that are then subsidized by the states, even where they are operated by private prisons. So you're keeping brown bodies under lockdown with criminal records, preventing them from voting, and then keeping their bodies in the beds that are subsidized by public taxpayer money. One expert said that one of the main reasons why African Americans were lynched before the Voting Rights Act came along is because of their farmland. So there was the first extra legal way, and then it became a technically legal way of economically dispossessing them and making them vulnerable towards the criminal justice system. And of course, then there's the interplay of actors, including corrupt judges. There have been so many documentaries on judges on the payroll that are trying to bring in younger and younger bodies for pettier crimes like fighting in school. And you see that this kind of profit monetizes every aspect of their lives, which is shaped almost from the start by inequity and misery. So in South Africa, with a similar history of racial apartheid, but with a Black majority, you see there are similarities in the framing and the pricing of poor bodies. So it seems like we have on the surface one of the best constitutions in the world, but the privileges conferred on those with capital trumps the poor. So you have the right to water, but that water is priced economically and people cannot afford it. Or you have the right to a home, but the home that will be allocated to you is a box where 50 people must share one toilet outside. So economic apartheid continues as a thread in South Africa, which is the reason why we are one of the world's most unequal countries. And rather than addressing the trauma of apartheid through reparations and equity, people are kind of ground down until they break or until they break you, which might account for the higher level of violence in our country. You know, the majority of people get less than $100 consistently every month. And even where they have a stable job in mines or the service industry or agriculture, it doesn't really allow for much beyond survival. So people are constantly kept at the edge of the knife's blade. And that accounts for the violence, because after 1994, it seemed like there would be justice in our space and time, that society would become more just and more empathetic towards human beings, but the knife was twisted because those policies were shaped in a very predatory way that removed the role of the public sector into the private sector, as Ruth will discuss. Her book, The Misery Merchants, Life and Death in a Private South African Prison, talks about a company that claims to be one of the largest employers in Africa, G4S. It's a private security company. The government gave the contract to operate a private prison, now the second largest in the world, to this company. And while all public prisons in South Africa are rife with disease and under-resourcing, overcrowding, and a lot of violence affecting prisoners as well as guards, the allegations of abuse and violence at this particular prison, which Ruth investigated and exposed, was supposed to be something more efficient, a safer system, and one that didn't have the systemic abuse and violence of public prisons. But she found electroshocking, forced medication with antipsychotic drugs, very long isolation periods, and a deadly and illegal prison environment. For example, concrete toilets and metal linings on the sides of prison walls were used for prisoners to attack each other, for prisoners to attack guards, and vice versa. So this, for the second largest prison in the world, tells us that they had a different motive, and that was making as much profit as possible. They made a 30% profit according to National Treasury, and they'll do so until 2026. Her brilliant expose, which began with articles in the Mail and Guardian, culminated in this book, and it's been followed up by formal inquiries. But to date, there has been no tangible consequences for the company G4S, which operates immigration detention centers, which performs in war zones as private security. Edwin Naidu will be joining her. He's a South African investigative journalist that is covering her work as well as the work of violence in prisons, and he works with the Wits Justice Project as well. So we'll turn it over to Ruth. Thank you.
Thanks, Khadisha, and thank you to everyone for joining the debate. I wrote the book Misery Merchants, all about a privately run prison run by G4S, a British multinational in Bloemfontein, South Africa. And it's a maximum security prison housing approximately 3,000 inmates, and it's one of the biggest prisons on earth. And I used to work as an investigative journalist for the Wits Justice Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. And the Wits Justice Project is a group of investigative journalists focused on the criminal justice system in South Africa. And for the Americans who've joined the debate, the Marshall Project in New York has a very similar focus. Our work fell into two broad categories: wrongful convictions and prison conditions. And prisons in South Africa, as Khadisha already mentioned, are terribly organized. They are heavily overcrowded, housed in dilapidated buildings. There's rampant violence and disease. And at the same time, there's very little societal concern because crime rates are really high and people don't really care about how criminals are treated behind bars. But prisoners would write to us about their prison conditions, and we would receive approximately 10 letters a week. And I noticed there were a lot of letters arriving from one particular prison, this G4S run Mangaung prison in Bloemfontein. And initially I went to this prison because I was investigating a potential wrongful conviction case of a man who was held there. The man turned out to be very guilty. But during my visit to Bloemfontein prison, the Bloemfontein prison, I also asked to speak to other inmates who'd written to us. And the management put me on a visitors list, and they didn't bother to Google my name, so they didn't realize I was a journalist. This was great from a journalistic perspective because I capitalized on this access, and I interviewed approximately 100 inmates over the period of a year. And I discovered inmates were being held in isolation for sometimes up to 3 years, and electroshocking was widely used to subdue inmates, as well as the involuntary medication with antipsychotic drugs, which the men were telling me made them walk, talk, and feel like a robot. It was actually called the robot drugs or the zombie drugs. And I also uncovered some suspicious deaths of inmates who had basically been tortured to death. And the prison guards were in an equally dangerous position. They were being stabbed very regularly, and the management didn't seem to care. Guards were being stabbed with the broken shards of ceramic toilet pots, and the management refused to replace them with unbreakable cast iron toilet pots because this costs a lot of money. In May 2013, I broke the story. It was published in The Guardian, it ran on the BBC, and was picked up by media all over the world. The then Minister of Correctional Services responded to my research, and he said it's unacceptable, and he promised to leave no stone unturned, and that an investigation report would be published within a month. The DCS, the Department of Correctional Services, they'd taken control of the prison a month before my research was published. because basically G4S had lost complete control of the order in the prison. It just descended into chaos. Initially, when I heard the minister react, I was very enthusiastic, and it seemed like there was like impact and accountability on the cards. But then the DCS, the Department of Correctional Services, started covering up for the company while it was in charge of running the prison. And it refused to release that investigation report that the minister had promised. And it had to be forced to release it by a judge 5 years later, because we pursued it through the courts under Freedom of Information laws. And so this report was ready in 2014, but only released in 2019. And the report confirmed what I had discovered. There was widespread use of torture and electroshocking, forced and irregular use of antipsychotic medication to subdue the inmates. And so according to this report, there was a culture of violence prevalent in the prison. After 10 months, in August 2014, without any explanation whatsoever, control of the prison was returned to G4S. And I was kept following the developments in this prison, and I noticed that some issues that I had uncovered had changed. So for example, the forced medication with antipsychotic drugs no longer was taking place in the prison hospital. It was now inmates were being forcibly injected in external hospitals. I interviewed, the violence against the inmates reduced, but most definitely did not disappear. Edwin will be talking about this. About a year ago, an inmate sent me a list of assaults that had been registered for his unit. And from the registration, it was very clear that the violence was very much a daily occurrence. And the violence against prison guards also is not under control at all. In October of this year, a guard was stabbed so badly, he was admitted to hospital in a critical condition. G4S has formally announced that it will withdraw from the South African prison sector once the contract expires in 2026. So despite widespread evidence of torture and abuse of inmates, this multinational is getting away with it without even a slap on the wrist. As far as I know, there have been no prosecutions, no fines imposed, no one held accountable for these crimes. And G4S can still run this prison for another 5 years. And they earn a nice amount of money, because I think Khadisha already mentioned in 2002, the National Treasury calculated that the prison produced a 30% return on equity rate on the prison. And that's an indication of a very, very, very handsome profit margin. So G4S has allowed and endorsed and carried out unacceptable violence against South African citizens, and it will get away with it unscathed and with its pockets still nicely filled. G4S's prison enterprise throughout the world, and specifically in South Africa, is all about money. And G4S also runs prisons, by the way, in South Africa, in Australia, and in the UK. And the company cuts corners to increase their income. So for example, in Mangaung prison, G4S would serve smaller meal portions than what they were paid for. And they would hand inmates certificates without providing the actual training, because they get paid per certificate. And also they structurally kept inmates who were eligible for reclassification. They kept them in the prison. They would deny their reclassification. And reclassification, it's a maximum security prison. So it basically houses inmates who've been classified as maximum security. If inmates behave after a certain amount of time, they're eligible to be reclassified to medium security. And that means they can go to a prison closer to home. So every single inmate wants this. And it was a recurring problem at Mangaung prison because they would be denied this reclassification and therefore would be kept in the prison, you could say, as a cash cow. And this is also where public and private prisons differ. In South Africa, public prisons are also terrible, and there's also a lot of violence and abuse going on, but I think private prisons are a little bit worse because this profit motive is attached to it. This is where I'd like to show you the trailer to my film.
It is quite frightening to wake up knowing what is it that you're going to face. Should anything happen, obviously you are dead. But it's a job.
Mangaung Maximum Security Prison, the first ever privately run public prison in the country.
The prison is run by the international security company G4S. It's a huge company and it's profit-driven. I started speaking to inmates. He has these scars here. We're kind of the only journalists they can turn to.
We're dealing with high-risk inmates, gangsterism. Anything can happen at any time.
Video footage shot inside the prison was leaked. And then I started talking to warders. I think probably up to like 70, 80 inmates that I've interviewed who said they've been electroshocked.
Somehow, I think I was part of that.
They were taught how to solicit information through torture.
They violated our rights.
Whenever services get privatized, costs go up.
An inmate is kind of a commercial entity.
We were beginning to see that we are used here. Things must change. You'll end up doing extreme things.
I'm not an enemy. No.
Will God ever forgive me for doing this?
Remember, hatred is something that you are not born with, you are taught to hate.
The revenue of the prison is over $630 million.
It's in their interest to have crime rates go up.
There's this phrase that they use. They say, adapt or die.
It's all about money. It's all about profit.
So this was the trailer of the film that I worked on called Prison for Profit. And it's basically the same story as I wrote about the book Misery Merchants. I also started looking into G4S operations in other countries because G4S is a multinational. It operates it's one of the biggest in the world. It operates in 90 countries, employs about 550,000 people worldwide. And so I was wondering, is this an isolated South African problem or is it a global problem? And I founded the Private Security Network. It's a network of investigative journalists throughout the world who are all looking into G4S operations in their country. And if you're interested in our work, you can find it on www.privatesecurity.network. For this network, I also investigated G4S run prisons in the UK, in Australia, and in the Netherlands. And I came across very similar problems and scandals in these countries. In Birmingham, for example, in the UK, in 2018, a G4S run prison was also taken over by the state, just like Mangaung prison, again, because G4S had lost complete control and violence and abuse were rife. I also looked into Manus Island, an offshore immigration detention center in Papua New Guinea, which was run by G4S, but on behalf of the Australian government. Violent riots broke out there in 2014, and one person died and 77 were injured. I also looked into Brookhouse Detention Center and the Medway Training Center, which are two G4S UK prisons, where undercover journalism broadcast on the BBC revealed systemic patterns of racism, abuse, and violence. Journalists connected to the Private Security Network have also dug into G4S's presence in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, which is also known as the biggest crime scene on earth. They've also looked into G4S's global financial constructions and the company's Scandinavian roots. And 6 journalists have worked together to expose labor-related issues that G4S seems to be running into in practically every country where they are active. And Al Jazeera will hopefully soon publish an article dealing with the position of G4S workers in 6 different countries. So watch this space. The private security network will be continuing its work beyond G4S because I'm in the process of developing the network into a more permanent structure focusing on the private security sector as a whole, because the problems that we're discussing are not uniquely G4S. And globally, it's estimated there are 20 million private security guards, and they outnumber police forces and armies globally. According to research carried out by The Guardian, more than 40 countries, including the US, China, Canada, Australia, and the UK, have more workers hired to protect specific people, places, and things than police officers with a mandate to protect the public at large, according to this Guardian investigation. In Britain, for example, there are 232,000 private security guards employed in 2015, compared with 151,000 police officers. In 2019, the global private security services market size was $216 million, and it's expected to reach $286 million by the end of 2026. It is telling that the money spent on private security globally outnumbers the global budget to eradicate poverty. In India, for example, there are an estimated 7 million private security workers compared to just 1.4 million police officers. In China, there are approximately 5 million private security workers compared to 2.7 million police officers. And lastly, not in the UK, the US, according to US labor statistics, there are over 1.1 million private security guards compared to 666,000 police officers. And while the police and the army are institutions that are bound by legislation, this is much less the case with the private security sector. The private security companies carry out tasks that are essential to the nation state, from incarcerating citizens to partaking in warfare to carrying out contracts in conflict zones. These companies operate from what I've called an accountability black hole, shifting jurisdictions when needed and ensuring secrecy through corporate confidentiality clauses in contracts. And I think this is worrying because private security contractors interface with some of the most vulnerable groups of people on earth, such as, for example, migrants, prisoners, and people in war zones. And the multinationals that are the big players in this sector, such as G4S, but also Prosegur, which is a Spanish multinational, Geo Group, Garda World, CoreCivic, ADT, to name a few, they are mostly bound by their share price on the financial markets. And so the privatization of security is not really subject to many democratic checks and balances. And the scandals that have erupted and the problems that plague the sector are testament to this. And who is speaking truth to these powerful companies? Who or what is holding them accountable? The private security network will monitor through investigative journalism private security operations in prisons, in war zones, and in immigration, and thereby hopefully increasing accountability. G4S has recently been sold to the American private security company Allied Universal. So in the near future, G4S will be no more. So why have the various prison and other scandals not had an effect on G4S? Why are there so little consequences? I really hope today we might find an answer to this seemingly unanswerable question. And I'm very honored that L.B. Eisen, the director of the Justice Program at the Brennan Law Center in New York and the author of the seminal book, Inside Private Prisons, An American Dilemma in the Age of Mass Incarceration, is joining us, as well as Edwin Naidu, who has my old job. He works as an investigative journalist for the Wits Justice Project in Johannesburg. And I'd like to hand over to the other speakers.
Thanks very much, Ruth. It's very large shoes to fill, I must say. And it's been a very illuminating period since July 2020, when I started. And I think, what you've done over eight years or so or longer, I think, it's been pioneering in terms of journalism, and also very helpful in that when I go there now, unfortunately, I can't do what you've done, which is gone to Mangaung very regularly, because we've had the lockdown from March last year. So a lot of the work has been done using WhatsApp, using emails, and getting calls from people who are linked to people behind bars. So it's work, though, and I think a lot of people want to talk to the Wits Justice Project because of the work you've done. It helps us get in there. We also have very good relations as a project with the Judicial Inspectorate for Prisons, that's led by a retired Constitutional Court Judge, Edwin Cameron. Their mandate is basically looking after the human rights of prisoners or inmates. And, he's been doing this for the past year or so. We've been working very closely with them. I think going back to the beginning of the discussion, the issue was about accountability. And, there definitely is a culture of, not a culture of accountability, a culture of a lack of accountability in South Africa. Accountability does not seem to exist, from the police force to prisons to public and private sector. Looking at one of the stories we did sometime last year or possibly earlier this year was in the police force itself, the South African Police Services. They paid out over the last 5 or 6 years an estimated 1.5 billion rands in civil claims. This was for wrongful arrest, and every year you get about 4,500 complaints. Out of those 4,500 complaints, a mere 2% probably gets convicted. And last year the government paid out something like 555 million rands, and 120 officers were charged or sanctioned for what they've done. So definitely that accountability we talk about, with the law enforcers, is not happening there. As a result, you've seen it spiral into the prisons as well. And we haven't just focused on Mangaung, although it's formed a huge basis of our work. We've done Leeuwkop, we've done a prison in Breda Valley, Western Cape. We've got complaints from Paulsmoor, from Westville in KZN. So the aim is to try and broaden the net, to look at what's been happening generally. Mangaung is very different because it was the first private-public partnership, so to speak, and run privately. The profit motive is very clear. You've expanded on that very well in the book. I think the one thing when I read your book 6 months ago, I thought, there should be something happening here. Heads should roll. And I think as a journalist, one can become very despondent when it does not happen. But, I think the work you've done gives us the encouragement not to give up or, not to stop. And I think books move people, but it should move people into action. And I think, we have a very passive society, as you can see right now. We react to different things, based now, I wouldn't say on a whim, but what is flavor of the moment. But I think, this is a very big story on G4S and what's been happening. And I think people, I'm not saying we're missing the story, but I'm saying that the way the story has been concealed makes it very difficult to actually get in there. But I don't think it's impossible. In the last week, I did speak to several union leaders at Mangaung, but I also noticed that, when you're talking about the G4S narrative on the profit factor, it extends way beyond Mangaung. In the last month, there's been about 5 or 6 MPs in cabinet asking questions about which government departments are using G4S. So I think the question is being raised in corridors of power. The key issue is whether the powerful will, take the question seriously and account for why they're using private security. So I think, it's starting to emerge. I've seen like the Minister of Labor, the Minister of Education, science and technology bodies like the CSIR. There's a whole lot of questions. In fact, about 5. And in the last year, there's probably been a lot more. I must say the answers haven't been as forthcoming. It goes back to what we talk about accountability, and we've seen challenges with that. I think, though, that, on the one hand, one gets the impression that the government is just waiting to see out this contract. But, seeing out the contract with G4S at Mangaung doesn't mean the G4S saga in South Africa ends. And, they probably would still be involved. I'm not sure about the ownership. There's question marks about ownership, someone else getting a stake in it. In fact, one of the questions that came up before Parliament, and there was an investigation by the broad-based Black Economic Commission into ownership. It's a requirement legally that you have an aspect of South African ownership, and G4S definitely did not adhere to that. So they've been investigated. That was 2 years ago. There's been no report on that as well. Again, we go back to accountability. So there's a whole circle of accountability issues that, should keep us even more vigilant as journalists to keep going back and saying, you promised this, or you investigated this, what's the outcome? So it creates, the work you've done in the book is actually can keep one busy for the next few years. I hope the project continues to secure the funding to do that, because it's not just a fun project. It's something that cuts at the heart of wrong and right. And I think when you talk to people in prison, they're human beings. Our constitution, as first speakers referred to, is the best in the world in terms of human rights, in terms of protection of rights, in terms of ensuring that everybody has the right, to protection, for example. Going back to Mangaung, even after your stories where you talked about the deaths of several inmates, attacks on warders, this week when I spoke to someone, the person said there's still an air of, fear, because, no one feels safe, whether you're an inmate there or warder. And the one aspect this person mentioned was that for 2,940 inmates, you've got a very small pool of people protecting them. And assuming something goes haywire in prison and, inmates get angry, people that are meant to be warders protecting you can easily be overrun. In fact, one of the sad stories is that there's a warder that has been paralyzed after being stabbed. In January, you had an inmate who, I think he was about 25 years old, who was killed. So you find that I think there's a sense of fear. There's a sense that G4S does not have the interest of both inmates and warders at heart. I think when you talk about the Al Jazeera story and, human resources, at Mangaung, I've heard, and, still working on confirming it, that there's discrepancies in what salaries are paid and what gets mentioned to government, to the department. And I think, there's a hell of a lot of work to do there. And I think, when we go back to accountability, I found that over the last 6 to 10 months, whenever we go to Department of Correctional Services, we get sort of fobbed off like nothing's happening. You've got to sort of show them that here's a picture, this guy was stabbed. You've got to show, the brutality of what's happening for them to believe and respond to you. That's actually not very good from, a government department that subscribes to the Constitution, supposed to hold its values dear. I think, we obviously will go the extra mile to do our job, but sometimes I feel that if I'm sharing a picture of someone with severe stab wounds or evidence of brutality, it's violating that person's right as well, because you don't have the permission, but you're trying to get answers. And then when they see the pictures, they'll tell you, no, these were doctored or they're old pictures. I've had those sort of experiences, and they're very touchy about being shown up. But I think for me, when people get touchy about being shown up, it makes you want to go more for it, and to, even if it's a difficult time now getting information to see things for yourself because of the pandemic, but they're prisoners or inmates who are contacting the project on a regular basis, saying this is what's happening, whether it's food that they're eating, the substandard food. So, excuse me, I think there's definitely, Mangaung is at the heart of the work that you've done, but we definitely looking at it on a broader level, and we'll, from our side, as the project, walking in your giant footsteps, we'll try to continue to unmask what's happening there. And we do appreciate your staying in touch and helping us from London, with information whenever necessary. And I think, the thing is, these are human beings behind bars. They have every right, and we can't discount and, neglect their right to anything that anyone in society should have. And I think, I was reading a book by David Goldblatt, a famous photographer, who did interesting work on prisoners in South Africa and London or UK, going back to the scene of the crime, taking them to where they were to try and understand crime. I think it's very different from, in the two countries, the rationale for turning to crime in South Africa as opposed to London. But I think you find very illuminating stories there. And I think, it shows you the heart of the human being and why. But I think, we out of crime, out of incidents like we're talking about, there's factor for huge profit. And I still think there's stories to be told. I don't know how, but we're going to have to find that information that's going to unearth, pieces like alluded to in the book, where you talk about G4S and what's been happening. I think the ownership issue is a key one that will probably steer us in the direction. And I think, it goes back to the heart of who's making the power decisions in government that opens the doors to G4S. I wouldn't be surprised, when you look at the state capture hearings taking place, there's a guy today on television who used to be, I think, with ESCOM. He's got 12 bank accounts sitting with, like, one account had 19 million rands and he didn't touch it. Sure, come on. You should have shared that with the project. We would have done good work with it. But, the accountability that we talked about, that's been a theme, is something that we have to make sure that we continue to support each other and challenge authorities into being a lot more accountable. So I think I can stop there. If there's any questions, we'll chat later after LB. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you, Ruth and Edwin, and all of you for spending your time today learning about these issues, and really looking forward to your questions. I don't want to talk too long because I know we've been talking for a while and all of you probably have a lot of questions. But I'll talk for a few minutes about the research that I've done and sort of how this fits in and sort of complements Edwin and Ruth's research. So I work at the Brennan Center for Justice. I direct our justice program at the Brennan Center, and our program focuses on reducing our reliance on incarceration. And as part of this work, I published a book a couple of years ago called Inside Private Prisons, An American Dilemma in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And the sort of inquiry of this book was really on sort of what was the American experience with these private firms. And, as I started to do my research, I realized that people who were less familiar with the criminal legal system in the United States actually didn't even know that we had private firms that managed prisons and jails and detention centers. So, I wrote the book really for a general audience, for those who just wanted to learn more about what our history has been with these private firms. And, for those of you who are familiar with private prisons, they've truly been criticized for as long as they've existed. Some argue they create perverse incentives that drive overcrowding by cutting costs and reducing the quality of life for incarcerated people, or that private prisons earn more revenue when individuals serve more of their sentence, right? Each bed day costs the government money. And so this might encourage private prison officials to hand out more infractions to keep people behind bars for longer periods of times in jurisdictions where in the U.S. we have, indeterminate sentences, right, where people's sentence can be extended while they're incarcerated, right? If someone is sentenced for, say, 10 to 12 years, receiving disciplinary infractions while you're incarcerated could actually ensure that you don't get parole and you spend more time behind bars. So that, aspect of officials, correctional officials who work for private firms has been criticized. Others take issue with this concept of a corporation profiting off of our predilection for incarceration, rewarded for the sheer number of people they house, rather than for successfully rehabilitating people, reintegrating them to rejoin our communities. And for decades, many scholars and policymakers have argued that there's just certain state functions that simply cannot be delegated, and one of those is punishment. And I was struck, by Ruth talking about the private security network, because part of the research for this book entailed learning more about how we have privatized so many of our military operations overseas. And, that same strain of argument is present when it comes to private firms. When we talk about these private military operations and these companies that really have contracts with whether it's the U.S. government or other governments to carry out our military operations overseas, we've delegated so many of these, what many of us think are core government duties. And, this is a theme, I think, that pervades all of our work. What can be delegated and what really should our government be in charge of? So the book focused on what does it mean for a for-profit firm to manage jails and prisons? Is it legal to delegate such a core government duty? Even if it is legal, is it moral to do so? Do these private firms actually save the government money? And if so, further, does that even validate the industry? And perhaps the most interesting question that I wrestled with while doing this research and writing the book was, how did we get to a point where such an important public policy, literally the managing of prisons and detention centers, was delegated to these major corporations? And just to provide a little context on what the numbers look like, how many people are actually in these private firms in the U.S. So there are about 7% of our state facilities are in the hands of these private firms. That's about 88,000, a little more, of the incarcerated individuals at the state level are in private prisons. About 16% of people in our federal prison system are in private firms. But remember, our federal prison system is fairly small. So that translates into a little more than 27,000 people. And something that people tend to be less familiar with is that we have very much outsourced the management of immigration detention facilities in this country to private firms. And these private firms house about 70% of our ICE detainees at this point. So when we talk about private firms, understanding how entrenched they are in immigration detention in the United States is very important. In terms of just some of the nitty-gritty about the states that tend to rely on private prisons more than others, so there are 5 states that actually house more than 20% of their prison population in these privately operated facilities. Montana has about 47% of its population in these facilities. And then New Mexico has 36%, Tennessee 29%, and Oklahoma and Hawaii each have about 25% of their incarcerated individuals in private prisons. And, as I talk to people about the research in the book, the first question people always have is, well, where did they come from? Have we always privatized our jails and our prisons? Is this something new? And really, the story of these firms in America starts with the mid 1980s. That was a time where more than half of the states faced significant budget shortfalls, traceable to these increased costs associated with operating their growing prison systems. And correctional agencies across the country were racing to comply with federal court orders demanding that they reduce overcrowding, trying to comply with these federal court orders. And at that time, a group of investors got together and they analyzed this new growth industry, which is the privatization of prisons. So around that time, private firms were willing to take their chances and build prisons on what's called spec. Literally forecasting where states might need more facilities, and forecasting that there were enough people being sentenced to these lengthy prison terms that more states needed correctional facilities. And, Thomas Beasley, the founder of the company CoreCivic that Ruth mentioned earlier, which it used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, the founder of the company in the 80s said, it was just like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers. So he said the company was founded on the principle that you could sell prisons that same way that you could sell cars, real estate, or hamburgers. And dealing with these lagging budgets and trying to make these court-ordered deadlines, most states and the federal government didn't create laws that would properly differentiate the private prison industry from, other private contractors. They were sort of lumped in with other contractors, garbage collectors, trash services. And we never, a big theme of this conversation is accountability. And we really never put that accountability on these firms. If the private prison industry had a pivotal moment, it was this time in the mid 80s. When the world really started to pay attention to the private prison industry, when they started to get these contracts from the state government and from the federal government. And, given that people running private prison firms analogize their role to selling hamburgers, it's really not that puzzling, right? It is puzzling that the government didn't do a better job of ensuring that there was accountability on this industry. And in 2011, the New York Times published an article about the phenomenon, and they noted over time, most states signed contracts. It was one of the largest transfers of state functions to private industry. And, for those of you who keep up with sort of the criminal legal system and what it looks like today, we have 2.2 million people behind bars in America. We incarcerate more people than any country on planet Earth. We have 4.5 million people on probation and parole in this country. And so we literally have the double the number of people who are locked up in custody right now are walking around in our communities on probation and parole, and happy to talk about that as well in the sort of Q&A. But that industry has also become very much privatized by these private firms as well. And so the book, some of the really important questions the book wrestles with are, where were the inspiring debates about the proper role of incarceration and punishment in the 80s and the 90s? Why were those conversations so rare? And, one of the answers I posit in the book is perhaps because so many prison facilities were under emergency court orders to literally reduce the number of incarcerated people they housed, that policymakers, correctional officers just felt like they didn't have the time to explore alternatives. And, they just outsourced the building of new facilities to these firms who said we can do an end run around raising bonds and raising taxes, and we'll build these facilities and get these contracts. And, the government contracted with these firms to quickly build capacity. And at the same time, they did so more cheaply, or they said they were doing so more cheaply than the government could manage. And so states and the federal government really never went to these firms and said, please build facilities that utilize great programming, that focus on human dignity, that focus on reentry and healing and trauma-informed care. Really the purpose of why we contracted with these firms in the US is to save money. And that's been our story, and that's been our experiment with private firms. And so if you want to learn more, please do check out the book, Inside Private Prisons, where I really trace the history and talk about what that experiment looked like, where I think that our experience with these private firms has been a moral failure and a public safety failure. And I interview a lot of incarcerated individuals who were either in private prisons at the time I was writing the book, or formerly were in private prisons, to also give them a voice in this storytelling. And so you can read about their experiences in the book as well. And in terms of sort of the theme of this panel, sort of end with this. There are other countries, and I actually traveled to Australia and New Zealand to visit 2 private firms there where the contracts look different than our U.S. contracts with these firms, where they actually created these these sort of so-called performance-based contracts, where they incentivize the firms to actually reduce recidivism. And so the firms that manage these prisons are paid more money if they actually reduce recidivism. And so I discuss that in the epilogue to this book as well, and sort of how there are different ways to contract with these firms. But really want to close with this idea that in the U.S., we never took the time to ensure that these firms were accountable. In most states, in many states in the federal government, the firms are not required to comply with Freedom of Information Act requests. And it's very, very hard to find out what happens in prisons. I mean, ask Ruth and Edwin, they're investigative journalists, and it's very, very difficult. These are really closed systems, black boxes. And so it's incredibly hard to find out what happens even in public prisons and detention centers. And when you add that layer of bureaucracy, when a private firm manages these facilities, it's much more complicated to get any sort of access to the individuals who work there, who are housed there, or how these prisons and detention centers operate. And, happy to also talk about some of the public accountability that I'm starting to see, and that a lot of us are starting to see in the US, based on advocacy from a lot of grassroots organizations as well. So would love Q&A. I'm sure you have questions for all the speakers. And again, really just didn't want to speak too long because there's so much to discuss.
Thank you so much, Ruth, Lauren, and Edwin, for those very informative and powerful talks. And it's quite admirable that you guys have devoted yourselves to a body of the population that most people would rather not think about or feel in theory or practice threatened by, but which does actually target a significant number of vulnerable people, some who can't make bail, some who are pushed in there for no justifiable reason. We have a question from Jim Henry in the audience. Jim, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Great presentations by everyone, very stimulating. I wanted to ask about what the success of various legal strategies might have been in South Africa and in the US to tackle these private companies. And secondly, this is really resonating with the whole other problem that we have in general, which is this trend toward privatization of public services. There's a big Biden infrastructure bill now before Congress, but privatization itself has a long history. It was actually pioneered by Mussolini for a lot of public services back in the 1930s, when he was trying to basically do it as you described here, get the cost of public services off the books, make it appear as if the budget was in balance. The UK has had a long experience with privatization, so I just wanted to relate it to that whole experience. It's another kind of horror story. But if you could just focus on the legal strategy, I'm particularly interested in that.
Yeah, I can answer that question. So there have been several court cases. One was a Freedom of Information request for that government report that was announced in 2013 and only got published in 2019 because the judge ordered it. So that was a successful court case. And then interestingly, I was approached by a British law firm called Lee Day, and they'd read about my research and they wanted to sue G4S in London for what they got up to in South Africa, which I was very excited about because, you know, it is a multinational. It does have its headquarters in the UK. So I thought that the link UK, so it was interesting. But a judge then decided there was a jurisdictional issue and the case should go to court in South Africa. So then it was transferred to a South African legal team and they did not a lot. The case hasn't really gone anywhere. And it's really frustrating because I decided to become a journalist not because my name has to be in the byline, but because I believe in, you know, in a better world and changing the world or whatever. And you hope, you know, that your work has impact. And it's been incredibly frustrating that a court case or accountability or, you know, any sort of response has sort of been absent. So yeah, I wish there was a big court case going on, but sadly not.
Although I can say from you know, the perspective of a South African citizen, Ruth is the only person, and Edwin, who have actually investigated this subject, and it isn't a very popular subject to investigate because South Africans do feel under the threat of violent crime, and they don't realize that a lot of the times it's inequity and poverty pushing people to become part of a system where, you know, the majority of criminals are not really criminals, they're desperate people, and they are pushed into a kind of a university of prison that forces them to become something they would not ordinarily have been. I think Thomas has a question now for.
Yeah, for all three really. So I understand completely the problem as you're outlining, and I thought we had a truly wonderful 1 hour lesson learning an enormous amount about the problem. And it's clear that if you organize it the way it's now organized, private prisons will tend to be a disaster because firms will have to, under two imperatives, they have a profit imperative where they try to cut corners and keep things cheap. And on the other hand, they have a moral imperative and they will generally put profits over people, in the nice phrase. So I want to say two things about it. One is that public prisons aren't so hot either. And so, you know, I know most of what I know about this from Law and Order, which is a program here in the United States, where occasionally the detective will say to the suspect, you know, if you don't confess, we will put you in Rikers Island and you will become somebody's girlfriend. This is said to a male suspect. So these prisons are also pretty awful. And so the question is really about the link between horrible prisons and privatization. So to play the devil's advocate, you know, you might say, look, we've gotten the incentives wrong. We should not go to a private company and tell the company to make it as cheap as possible, warehouse people as cheaply as possible, and give them incentives to drag more and more people into the prison system. But rather, we should do it a little bit like Lauren-Brooke said towards the end of her remarks, you know, when you talked about, I think, New Zealand, have incentives where we reward companies for a lack of recidivism. We take the temperature in the prisons and see how the prisoners feel about the prison, whether they are learning something, get educated, and so on. So we have various parameters that we specifically put into the payment function so that firms can make more money if, let's say, somebody in prison earns a BA or something, or somebody who was once in prison never shows up in prison again, and so forth. Would that potentially work? And secondly, might that work even better than a public prison system where there aren't such incentives and where people may just be indifferent?
So that is a key question, and that was one of the sort of key topics of this book. Are there other ways of contracting with these firms? Is anyone doing anything different? And it's hard to answer that question because we've never contracted that way, and that's why I think journalists who are covering this prison in New Zealand, the Auckland Correctional Facility, and the Ravenhall prison in Australia, their work is really important. And I went and visited those prisons just because I wanted to learn more about those contracts and what life was like at those facilities. So we've never contracted like that. And we've never done that because the government has never asked the firms to do so. So if we, for example, tore up all the current contracts and restructured them as performance-based contracts, the government could say you need to have better programming than we have, and we've never done that. And you were right. You said it's not like these public facilities are good places. No, all of our prisons, public or private, these are places where people experience trauma, where people are not provided programming, where there's wait lists for programming, where people are assaulted, sexually assaulted. So we are creating places that harm other human beings, right? And whether it's public or private. And so I think you're right to say the problem is with our system of punishment. The problem is with our punitive excess. The problem is with our carceral state, where we have 2.2 million people behind bars and 4.5 million people on probation and parole, who, by the way, could get revoked very easily back to one of these places. And I think it's important to sort of watch and pay attention to what happens with these other prisons that have started to contract this way, these performance-based contracts in other parts of the world. But I have to tell you, so when I returned home after visiting the prison in New Zealand, the New Zealand Ombudsman issued a report, and my understanding is that Serco, the firm that manages the private prison, the Auckland Correctional Facility in New Zealand, did actually get a payment because it was able to reduce recidivism more than the government did when they compared the different cohorts for that study period. But at the same time, the Ombudsman report revealed that there were a lot of problems at that prison, and that people were locked in their cells for far longer than they should have been if there were staff, if they weren't staffed up enough with enough correctional officers on certain days. And I think it's really important to understand that, there are many lessons, right? One is that our government never asked the private firms to do anything better than they were doing. And we know that our government does a terrible job at managing jails and prisons. So that is a big problem with the way that we started to develop a relationship with these firms. It was all about cutting costs. And then I think, importantly, our goal should be to shrink the size and scope of our carceral state, right? So the number one thing we can do if we want to, if the Biden administration were listening right now, if we want to reduce our reliance on these firms, we would want to significantly shrink the number of people in our jails, our prisons, and our immigrant detention centers. And that would ensure that we no longer need to rely on these firms. So shrinking the scope is the most important thing we can do. And then secondly, we shouldn't view these, and we never should have viewed these contracts through the lens of saving money. Because we know that rehabilitation costs money. We know that education behind bars costs money. But that's money that we should be spending to ensure human dignity, to ensure that these people are treated, humanely and given opportunities to succeed once they are released. So that was a long-winded answer, but absolutely the things that, the book wrestles with. But the number one thing we should be doing is just really ending mass incarceration in the U.S. as we know it.
Yeah, if I
you
could respond to that question. It's a good question, and I'm always asked that question. People always say, oh, but public prisons are equally terribly run. Absolutely true, especially in South Africa. The state of Pollsmoor, for example, in Cape Town is absolutely horrendous and completely undignified and should be addressed. But I think the problem is with private prisons, my problem is not so much the private part, it's the for-profit part. I think you should never attach a profit motive to incarcerating people. I think that just is fundamentally wrong. The fact that it's private, I don't really have such a problem with, because I don't think the states are doing such a brilliant job. And you could arguably conceive of prisons that are run by non-profits. I think that's a very interesting idea. That you similarly outsource the running of prisons, but outsource it to non-profit organizations who have a non-profit aim and a non-profit goal. And I think LB was mentioning this, that there are some relatively positive examples of private prisons in Australia. It might have been Ravenhall. It's one of the prisons in Australia has a contract that stipulates that the private contractor, part of the contract is that it needs to bring down recidivism rates. And I think that's really interesting, because that's sort of beyond prison. So it's not just how do they treat people when they're in prison, but it's also after they've left. So I think that they're definitely, it's not black and white, but for me at least, but I do really have a problem with attaching a profit motive to incarcerating people. That is, in my view, the cause of all problems.
And you see it in the immigration space also. So a couple of years ago, when the Trump administration was sending out requests for proposals to contractors to build immigration facilities in the interior of the country, the CEO of CoreCivic was on an investor call and mentioned, well, people who are detained in the interior of the country actually spend longer, they actually spend more time behind bars. And so, I think that draws a direct link to, look, these firms are getting paid more if people are spending longer in their facilities, if their beds are being used longer. And that's really important, right? That what Ruth just said, there is, these firms, two of the largest private prison firms in the U.S. are publicly traded, and they owe a duty to their investors to turn a profit. And at the end of the day, they are for-profit companies. And, when I was writing the book, I was talking about the movement of these firms into the community correction space, the probation, the parole, the electronic monitoring, the drug treatment. And I sort of played devil's advocate and said to this professor I was interviewing, but isn't that better, right, than in custody profit? And he sort of said, there's still that profit motive, right? There's always a profit motive, and those people can just be recycled back into the private prisons or back into state prisons, or kept longer in these community correction settings. And so that is really important to understand, no matter, and I'm someone who's written about how interesting these new models are, but they have limits, that these are private firms at the end of the day.
If I can add there, in South Africa, we talk a lot about, the human rights friendly treatment aimed at rehabilitating prisoners. And we find that 22 years after Nelson Mandela said, our former president, he said that the way society treats its prisoners is one of the sharpest reflections of its character. But South African jails are overcrowded with incidents of, abuse and gangsterism very rife. And yes, we've heard that there's been a lot of operational challenges in terms of the reporting. That's in terms of information we get out of there. And it's very weak, very guarded. And even on the overcrowding, you don't get statistics that you should. So there's been huge question marks over the independence of the body that's charged with monitoring and oversight of South Africa's correctional system. And, one can argue that Madiba's dream is just a dream because this body that's being led by a former judge to rectify this actually it's made some progress, but it hasn't got to where it's going. And if you look at it, the whole thing, we have just one G4S spreading its tentacles, right? Oh, well, it's got it strongly in Mangaung, but throughout the other parts of the country in different areas. But I think the key thing is government should actually be held accountable into doing its job. And if it's, I listened to Ruth on getting NGOs involved. I just feel that NGOs are also able to be seduced by profits in a very subtle way. And, there's been a number of stories about people with fat cat salaries and, siphoning of funds. So, one could replace a structure that's abhorrent with another one that's equally potentially troublesome. So, what about getting government to do its job properly to ensure that it adheres to its own constitution and sets about, implementing and carrying it out? But I think, obviously one does need creative ideas in terms of dealing with it. But for sure, from what we've seen over the last 10 months or so, it's been very difficult getting the rehabilitation drive to have less people in prisons, which is what the authorities seem to want. But of course, the profit factor is for organizations like G4S would be to ensure that the figure stays constant so that they reap the rewards for it. Thanks.
Marina on the chat box has made a very important comment about how we can make an impact to inmates, and she's put a link in there. A question that I have for Ms. Eisen and also for Ruth and Edwin. For Ms. Eisen, to what extent, I mean, when you look at individual US states on a global scale, you see that over 20 to 23 southern states have the highest incarceration rates. They also have the highest disenfranchisement rates. So to what extent do you feel that the system of imprisoning Black and brown bodies, largely Black and brown bodies in the US, is a way to control political participation, to control the outcome of elections? Is that a deliberate strategy, or is it just an outcome of how the system works? And a question to Ruth and Edwin, in terms of a human rights ladder, are companies like G4S pushing the exploitation envelope as far as they have been doing because they know that, there's a cost-benefit analysis and nobody will care about a prisoner, there'll be no legal accountability for a prisoner, that there's just no value for these people in society? As Edwin mentioned, Nelson Mandela himself was a prisoner, and we know that many people who go to prison are not just there because of crime. They can be political activists, they can be journalists, it can be a host of people who are framed under the same umbrella. So for Ms. Eisen, disenfranchisement and political participation, and for Edwin and Ruth, a human rights ladder.
Sure. So, I mean, that is a significant question. And, you are right that, sorry, there are people walking behind me. There are vast racial disparities in our criminal legal system. 1 in 3 Black men are incarcerated in their lifetimes in the US compared to 1 in 17 white men. Our prisons have populations that are disproportionately Black. And we are also living at a time for many decades, in fact, where we've experienced the over-policing of marginalized communities, of poor communities of color, and at a time of police violence that is perpetuated against Black Americans every single day. And, your question is a lot to unpack. Some of these policies, we know that some of the policies that created the war on drugs were purposeful, right? They targeted urban areas, communities of color. If you look at the discrepancy between sentences for powder cocaine that was used more often in white suburban areas versus crack cocaine that was used more often in cities where if you look at the rate of cocaine use against white and Black people, for those groups, the use is similar, right? But crack cocaine, the sentence was made much more significant because policymakers wanted to target, Black Americans, people living in cities at the time. And I think that is sort of illustrative of some actual public policy that was focused on one community over another and penalizing one community over another. We know so much about the disproportionate impact of our criminal legal system on Black communities, Latino communities in this country. A lot of the work that my program focuses on is about the wealth extraction of the criminal legal system, whether it's through fees and fines, whether it's through the lost wages that are associated with criminal convictions and time spent in prison. Our criminal legal system extracts wealth from poor communities, from communities of color, from communities we've never invested in. And so it's really important that moving forward, we illustrate how we can break that cycle of intergenerational poverty that the criminal legal system creates, that our law enforcement apparatus creates, that our carceral structure creates. And that's a lot of the work that our program is focusing on right now.
Yeah, I'll respond to your question around the human rights ladder. And I think you're asking if G4S cares at all. Well, don't really think so, not at least based on the research I did at Mangaung prison. And I think that investigation clearly actually shows why for-profit prisons, in my view, are not a good idea, because G4S was constantly trying to save money on labor. So they were running this big maximum security prison where, quite violent people were sent to, and they just refused to up the number of workers. So the worker to inmate ratio was 1 to 60, if I remember correctly. Like in the UK, they were already complaining about 1 to 30, the ratio 1 to 30. In South Africa, in a maximum security prison, it was 1 to 60. So there were very few guards there to actually control the inmates. And that's where most of the problems started. It was around, not having enough people to actually run the show. And you can see that the prison guards, year after year after year, in all their negotiations and whatever they had with management, they were constantly asking for backup. They were constantly asking for, they constantly felt really threatened and unsafe. And they were constantly asking for management to appoint more guards so they would be safer, and they never did because of money. And they never replaced the ceramic toilet pots, which were just being used as weapons the whole time. They never replaced them because of money. And that's with a lot of sort of underlying problems, because it's not just it's not a freak show. It's not as if this prison, there are loads of really, really dangerous, violent people held. I mean, it was very much something that relates back to how it was organized and how and the infrastructure and the employment plan, let's say. That's that I can, again, with G4S prisons in other countries, such as Birmingham prison, which was also taken over by the state. You can also see there it's a labor problem, because it had 700, I think 700 or 750 guards working in the prison, with a prison population, I think, of 1,600. And that was halved. And because the company wants to save money. And that's when all the problems started, because there was a loss of control. Inmates sensed it. They started acting up. There were not enough guards to control them. So again, I really think the human rights aspects of private prisons can basically all be related back to profit, making a profit.
Well, yes, I think, in South Africa, we pay lip service to human rights, holding out the Constitution on Human Rights Day, March 21st, and we'll do it again this coming Tuesday, Freedom Day. So, for me, the G4S issue around Mangaung and how it managed the prison, how it's violated human rights, it's actually a microcosm of South Africa. And, when one makes an argument that you pay lip service, you got to back it up. And I think, if you look at Marikana massacre, where 34 miners were killed by security police, during protests for a living wage, that it shows you the extent to which, people's lives matter less. And these are ordinary workers working in mines. Then you've got people in prisons, trying to serve their term, so to speak, and find them being treated very poorly. So generally, you've had human rights being talked about in glowing terms. I think the Mandela factor is gone right now. That we once, everyone thought, wow, South Africa has the best human rights culture in the world. You just go back to COVID. The first week of COVID, I think, when the pandemic broke and all the lockdown rules came into effect, you had something like 7 people killed in a month due to police brutality. So, when you're talking about human rights, if the government is not setting the right example, how do you expect a private sector company based on profit to say this is how we take human rights seriously? Because not once throughout all the shenanigans that have been exposed, if you look at Ruth's book, if you look at the 2019 report that came out, there's been no sort of atonement for what they've done as a company in terms of violating the rights of inmates. So I think, when you talk about human rights, you've got to, mean it rather than do it as we've done it. The document, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights has to come alive and mean something. Otherwise, we're on a road to nowhere.
Yeah. Ms. Eisen has to jump off for another call in 15 minutes. But while we have her, a question about the Biden administration and legal activism. Is there a way for us to, for example, pressure the shareholders of these private prison groups to change their practices? How does she feel that the Biden administration will change the approach towards those who are incarcerated, their rights to vote, and so forth?
Sure. And I'll give all of you my email if you need to reach out to me separately. It's lbeisen@nyu.edu. Please feel free to follow up. And in terms of public accountability, we have seen the large banks in the U.S., the big Wall Street banks, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, SunTrust, Barclays, have said that they will no longer finance the private prison industry. And these were the big banks that were providing a lot of capital to Geo Group and CoreCivic. Again, the 2 largest private prison firms in the U.S. So that was unexpected in terms of all of these banks sort of, within a few weeks of each other, a few months of each other, all making that announcement. And that was due to a lot of activism on the grounds, organizations at the, divestment campaigns on university campuses, grassroots organizations joining together, and nonprofits working together to pressure the banks to move away from the industry. And, the question is, well, what will happen now? And, some speculate that non-bank lenders, such as private equity investors or hedge funds, might fill the void. Alternatively, these firms may seek capital from smaller banks that haven't historically partnered with the industry, or additional banks overseas that they haven't traditionally had relationships with. Additionally, in terms of public accountability, 3 states, California, Illinois, and Nevada, recently passed legislation attempting to curb the operations of these private firms that manage prisons and detention centers. And we've also seen some, we've seen a lot of divestment efforts both on university campuses and also in some cities in terms of public pension funds that have that are trying to move away from these private prison firms. And in terms of the Biden administration, every single person who ran for president of the United States this last cycle on the Democratic ticket promised to eliminate private prisons in one way or another. It was just something they all added to their policy platform. And President Biden was one of those candidates. And we have seen one indication so far of the Biden administration's commitment to moving away from these private firms. So, within days of taking office, the administration issued an executive order that what it does is it tells the Bureau of Prisons not to renew contracts with these firms as they come up for renewal. And the media made a big deal about this executive order, but it's actually not that significant. And that's because, I gave you those statistics at the beginning of this conversation, but there are very few people actually in federal prison when you look at sort of the carceral landscape in the US right now. And, all it does is it tells the BOP not to renew those contracts as they come up for renewal. A lot of these contracts are 10-year contracts. And so the executive order doesn't include state prisons, and it doesn't include immigration detention facilities. So it's a signal, perhaps that there's more to come from the Biden administration in terms of other work or incentives, perhaps through federal funding, that it might send states if they reduce their reliance on these firms. We'll have to see what happens. But that was an early signal that the administration is trying to move away from these firms.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you have to leave after this for another call, but you provided such an invaluable and powerful presentation. Thank you so much. And Ruth and Edwin, a question sent to me on the chat is, to what extent were your lives put at risk or in danger as you are or were investigating these subjects? And there's another question from Jared, who asks about the changing ownership of G4S and whether that affects the ongoing contract with the company, whether they can turn it over, and also a question to you about legal activism involving financiers, pension funds, and so forth. Do you think that by targeting them, the Mangaung contract can be ended sooner rather than later?
Well, to start with the question about change of ownership, that's going to be really interesting because Allied Universal, which I think I mentioned is a big American private security contractor, they've already indicated they want to divest all the prisons. They want nothing to do with prisons. So I have no idea what's going to happen. Now, I guess G4S has been bought, so I guess Mangaung prison belongs to Allied, but they have strongly indicated they want nothing to do with prisons. Maybe because G4S has a terrible track record in that field. I don't know. But yeah, so that's pretty unclear. Just remind me of the other questions.
The other question was about your personal safety. I was asked whether your safety, because you went to the prison over 100 times before they realized that you were a journalist, right? And they had a long, big file on you.
Yeah, my picture was hung up at the entrance of the prison saying, anybody who looks like her, don't let her in.
Oh my God.
So thankfully, I've been threatened, intimidated, harassed, you could say, but thankfully nothing very, very serious. There were, it was mainly, the threats mainly came not so much from G4S. They were sort of always very non-committal. They tried not to respond ever. But it was DCS, it was the Department of Correctional Services, who did various things. One of the things they did was send an official DCS official to my office to meet with me, to tell me to stop talking to a source I was meeting completely in secret, an anonymous source. They were like, you cannot talk to this person anymore. And I said, do you go around telling journalists not to talk to people? It's like, no, but you really shouldn't talk to this person anymore. Next thing I know, they filed a complaint against me with the press ombudsman, a complaint that thankfully went nowhere. And then in the end, I started getting personal text messages from the National Commissioner of Correctional Services, Edwin Zakmodise. You'll probably remember his name. But yeah, so I've been threatened, and legal action has been threatened, and I've been harassed and intimidated, but never really anything very serious, I could say. I don't know about you, Edwin. Did they give you a bad time?
No, well, on my side, it's been a lot more easier thanks to the pandemic. In fact, I get more love letters from a vice chancellor of a particular university for, exposing inactivity on racism and a whole lot of gender issues. So I do have kickback from, pushback rather, not kickback, from what the guys at DCS, always angry, always uppity. And, so I found that if you present the information to them, you give them the evidence, they can't say, no, it's not happening. Because when you give I learned from the first time when I sent something, they said, no, it's not happening there. And then I go back to him and say, this is happening here. And, when you give it to them as fact and you tell them, you show them that you're doing the job for them, they come back to you, they don't like it because you're showing them up to their bosses. So I think, pressure will come when we expose more, and if you do it on a consistent basis. But I don't think I'm on the Christmas greeting card list. So, but fortunately,
Edwin, just a small bit of advice:
bad.
never admit to a kickback on a recorded session.
You can see I'm getting hungry. It's Friday.
Yeah, just a final question before we wrap up. Was there any political gain or involvement from the large number of BEE companies that got a cut in the construction of the project without actually having a track record in this kind of work? Question for Ruth and Edwin.
Yeah, so the prison contract is actually in hands of a consortium called the Bloemfontein Correctional Contracts, BCC. And G4S is one of 5 shareholders in this consortium. And the other 4, they're all sort of BEE, South African, I'd say dodgy companies. And I, of course, in my investigation, really looked into these companies, and seemingly they were like shell companies, not really any sort of tangible activities. One was registered as a charity, but was not doing any charity work. And interestingly, also talking about BEE, by the way, for the non-South African audience, BEE is Black Economic Empowerment, and it's a measure that was introduced after apartheid to help Black business people rise up through the ranks or make a living, basically. And it's basically considered positive, what we know as sort of positive discrimination, you could say. And as what you can see in practice is that it's often abused and often used for sort of corrupt ends and whatever. And interestingly, there's also a BEE case pertaining to G4S because in 2005, if I remember correctly, G4S South Africa founded this employee benefit fund. It's probably something they had to do under BEE law. And basically, under this employee benefit fund, all G4S employees in South Africa are supposed to get a 13% cut of the profits that the company's making. And this case went to the BEE Commission because guess what? Since 2005, South African G4S employees have received zero. They haven't been getting anything. But here again, I just feel like G4S in South Africa and maybe in the world, it's just constantly protected. So here again, this BEE case whereby this employee benefit fund that's basically meaningless. I flagged this, I think, 2, maybe even 3 years ago, and I emailed the BEE Commission, what's happening, what's the investigation, what's the outcome, and to this day they haven't answered me, and they haven't, as far as I know, investigated G4S for this transgression, and I don't understand why, but G4S has just this high levels of protection in society.
Yeah, I think you're also picking closely at very powerful political bones because of the connections between those companies, other people like Ace Magashule you mentioned. Jim Henry has a good comment about 30% of allied G4S's owner being sold and high-level connections, including Obama's former Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, has a big chunk. Thoughts on about influencing these folks. And then Elsa has a question about Scandinavia, is there any more insight in the development of Northern Europe?
Oh yeah, by the way, what I just wanted to mention as well, people can email me as well. And also, if people want to see the film, Prison for Profit, send me an email and I'll send it over. I can send it over through so my email is ruthhopk@gmail.com, or you can contact Khadisha or Thomas and they're welcome to give you my email address. And I'm more than happy to send over the film. Now the question about Scandinavia, I'm wondering if there's more insight into... I'm not sure I understand this question. Is the private security industry the same as oil companies, I think?
I actually saw a little documentary about a prison in Scandinavia, and it looked much better than my house growing up. I was thinking maybe I should head over to prison in Norway.
It is weird. G4S does have Scandinavian roots, as do a lot of other private security companies, such as Securitas, Securicor, I think. And interestingly, it's one of the most peaceful, wealthy regions in the world right now. But that's where a lot of private security companies have their roots. So that is sort of an interesting contrast.
And it's interesting that Dutch law has a ring-fenced legal and financial system, secrecy system, that allows for them to launder a lot of their profits, create a lot of losses and so forth. I think G4S had that as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So they are asking for your email, but I think as Edwin might be a bit hungry, if there's any more questions, we could have them email directly to the panelists, Ms. Eisen, Ms. Hopkins, and Edwin, and perhaps we should end off the chat now.
Yeah.
Most happy to be in email contact with anyone who needs anything additional. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Great chatting.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, guys.